At the EU-Africa Summit in Brussels, when 27 European leaders and 12 African heads of state gathered, no one could have predicted how that day would end. When it was Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré's turn to speak, the hall fell into respectful silence. Traoré walked to the podium, looked at his speaking notes, and suddenly turned off the microphone in front of him and left the hall. As all cameras followed him in astonishment, diplomats whispered anxiously, what had happened? Behind the scenes, a single sentence uttered by the French representative had triggered a crisis that would change not only Traoré's diplomatic career, but all Africa-Europe relations. Just 5 minutes before the diplomatic crisis suddenly erupted, Ibrahim Traoré was meeting with French Foreign Minister Jean-Philippe Moreau in a private room. Moreau, with a fake smile on his face, had said, "President Traoré, before you make your speech, I would like to remind you that criticizing French companies' activities in Burkina Faso could have unfortunate consequences for you and your country." Traoré's facial expression didn't change, but the coldness in his gaze seemed to have dropped the room temperature by several degrees. "Is this a threat, Minister?" No, said Moreau, raising his hands in a reassuring manner. "Just an observation. We appreciate our friends, President, and our friends appreciate us. I hope we can come to an understanding." It was at that moment that Moreau played his last card, unknowingly uttering words that would detonate a diplomatic bomb. "After all, don't you think it's fair to expect a little gratitude after all the aid Europe has given to Africa?" Gratitude. One word. That single word that changed the face of Burkina Faso's leader, causing a dangerous light to suddenly flash in his eyes. Traoré slowly stood up. "So, gratitude," he said, so quietly that Moreau had to lean forward. "You expect us to feel gratitude for what you took by force. After centuries of exploiting our countries, now you want gratitude. President Traoré, you misunderstood." "No, I understood perfectly well, Minister," said Traoré. "And you cannot buy this deal on the honor and independence of my people." As Traoré left the room, Moreau called after him, "Please be reasonable, it's just a speech." But Traoré had already made his decision. 5 minutes later, in the stunned silence of the hall, as diplomats and leaders were formulating theories in their minds to understand the sudden exit of the Burkina Faso president, Traoré's assistant, Marie Ouagadougou, was collecting his belongings and throwing a file toward the French delegation. "Thank you, but we don't need your help," she said coldly, dropping the file on the table. The file opened and the papers inside scattered. A list of aid projects France had promised for the past 5 years but never delivered. Outside the summit hall, Traoré was walking quickly, followed by Marie and his security team. "Prepare the car," said Traoré. "We're going to the airport immediately." "But Mr. President," said Marie, trying to catch up with him, "there's an important session tomorrow. Climate change financing." "We won't be here tomorrow," said Traoré, quickening his pace. "Burkina Faso will not accept new colonialism offered under the guise of aid by Europe." When they reached the streets of Brussels, it was drizzling. Traoré's silhouette stood small but erect in the massive shadow of the European Commission building. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Minister Traoré," he said. "Emergency meeting. In 2 hours, we're reviewing the status of all French companies in Burkina Faso." A brief pause. "Yes, today. Exactly today." Marie looked concerned. "Mr. President, this could create a very serious diplomatic crisis." Traoré looked at her, determination in his eyes. "Some crises are necessary, Marie. Some crises are transformative." In Brussels, the organizers of the EU-Africa Summit were in a panic. The sudden departure of the Burkina Faso delegation had completely disrupted the flow of the summit. European Commission President Helga Schumann called French Foreign Minister Moreau to a private meeting. "What happened?" asked Schumann as soon as the door closed. "The entire summit is now at risk. The media is going crazy." Moreau shrugged. "I don't know, he overreacted. I just implied that Africa should be grateful for European aid." Schumann looked at him in disbelief. "Grateful? Did you really say that? What's wrong with that?" Schumann sat at the table, putting her hand to her forehead. "Jean-Philippe, Gratitude is one of the worst things you could say to African leaders. The legacy of colonialism, history, God. You're exaggerating, said Moreau, sitting in the chair. Burkina Faso needs us, not the other way around. Give them some time, they'll come back. Schumann shook her head. I don't think so. Traoré is not like other leaders. And if other African countries show solidarity with him, what can they do? Asked Moreau dismissively. Everything, said Schumann. They can do everything. Just 12 hours later, in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré had called his own cabinet to an extraordinary meeting. Television cameras were ready to broadcast the president's announcement live. The events that took place yesterday in Brussels, Traoré began, facing millions of Burkinabe, were a relic of the past. When we went to sit at a negotiating table, as equals, we discovered that we were asked for gratitude. We were treated not as friends, but as servants. The camera showed the serious faces of the ministers in the hall. Today, Burkina Faso is drawing a new path, continued Traoré. We are suspending our privileged economic relations with France. All French companies in our country will have 3 months to be examined to determine if they truly serve the interests of the Burkinabe people. A murmur of shock rose in the hall. At the same time, on screens in financial centers around the world, shares of French companies began to fall. However, said Traoré, making a gesture for silence with his hand, this is just a beginning. I propose a new form of relationship where Europe truly wants to help Africa, if it really wants to. A relationship based on equality, respect, and mutual benefit. Traoré made a 20-minute speech in which he proposed a new model that would allow Africa's natural resources, European technology, and the development of both sides. When his speech ended, the hall was giving him a standing ovation. When the cameras turned off, Foreign Minister Ouagadougou approached him. Mr. President, the French will see this as an insult. Let them see it that way, said Traoré. We will no longer play their old games, but the economic consequences will be painful in the short term, Traoré acknowledged, but in the long term, we'll be free. The video of Traoré's speech went viral. It was viewed tens of millions of times, within hours. Across Africa, people took to the streets from Senegal to Kenya, from Egypt to South Africa. The slogan, "Not gratitude, respect," echoed across the continent. In Europe, the media was giving mixed reactions. Some commentators described Traoré as arrogant and overreacting, while others praised him as the brave voice of new African leadership. European Commission officials were holding emergency meetings to get the situation under control. The summit needed to be saved. Burkina Faso's absence was affecting other African countries. The Senegal, Mali, and Chad delegations had also begun to stage protests. Helga Schumann turned to Jean-Philippe Moreau. You need to fix this, she said angrily. You need to apologize. Personally. Me? Asked Moreau incredulously. Apologize to an African leader? Yes, said Schumann. Or French companies will lose billions of euros worth of deals. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across the entire continent. 2 days later, Jean-Philippe Moreau's private jet landed in Ouagadougou. On his way to the presidential palace in a car with closed windows, he could hear the protests of the crowds. Not gratitude, respect, thousands were shouting. Ibrahim Traoré received him in a plainly furnished office, an unpretentious office that seemed almost Spartan compared to the luxurious ministry rooms in Paris. President Traoré, said Moreau, extending his hand. Thank you for arranging this meeting. Traoré shook his hand, but there was no expression on his face. Please sit down, Minister. First of all, said Moreau, I want to apologize for my words. Gratitude was an unfortunate choice. Unfortunate? Asked Traoré. Or honest? Moreau hesitated. What do you mean? Your gratitude word was unfortunate because it revealed your true thought, said Traoré. You still view Africa through the same lens. We owe you. We are inferior to you. But the world is changing, Mr. Moreau, and Africa is changing too. Moreau, with a diplomat's training, attempted to change the subject. I hope you will reconsider your decision about our companies. French companies employ thousands of people in Burkina Faso. Yes, said Traoré, with low wages, poor conditions, and most of your profits going back to France. This is no longer acceptable. What do you want? Asked Moreau, getting straight to the point. Traoré pulled out a file from his desk. A new agreement, equal partnership terms. 60% of profits will stay in Burkina Faso. Worker rights will be guaranteed. Environmental standards will be raised. Moreau looked at the file with suspicion. This is ambitious. This is fair, said Traoré, and just a beginning. What else? An apology to the African Union, said Traoré. Official, public, for your gratitude discourse and for the ongoing effects of the colonial legacy. Moreau's face reddened. That's impossible. The French government would never— Then we have nothing to talk about, said Traoré, standing up. Good day to you, Minister. Wait, said Moreau, raising his hand. Maybe something can be arranged, but an official apology, that's very difficult. If it were easy, said Traoré, it would have been done already. Moreau took a deep breath. I will convey your agreement to Paris. And, pressed Traoré, and I will offer my personal apology. Publicly. Traoré nodded. Sufficient for a start. The next day, Jean-Philippe Moreau made a live statement on Burkina Faso national television. His face was formal, his voice controlled, but the words he spoke were historic. I apologize for the language I used at the EU-Africa summit in Brussels, he said. My gratitude remark was an unfortunate clue to how France and Europe understand our relationship with Africa. This understanding must now change. We must turn a new page based on equality, respect, and mutual benefit. As he finished his statement, he added something unexpected. Additionally, on behalf of the French government, I apologize for the mistakes and injustices committed in your country during the colonial period. History cannot be changed, but the future can be built. When the cameras turned off, the relief on Moreau's face was visible. His assistant immediately rushed to his side. Paris is calling, he said worriedly. The Prime Minister is very angry. That last part wasn't in the written text, Moreau sighed. I know, he said, but it was right. Ibrahim Traoré had watched the speech from the television screen. His advisor, Marie, entered the room. Mr. President, she said, you did it. No European country had ever apologized like this before. This is just a beginning, said Traoré. Now, the real work begins. Your decision about French companies? Is it still valid? Of course, said Traoré. The words were nice, but I want to see actions. The 3-month review period continues. Marie smiled. And other African countries are joining you. Senegal and Mali have also started similar inspections. Traoré nodded. Can you feel the balance changing, Marie? For the first time in centuries, Africa has a chance to shape its own destiny. All of this stemmed from a single word, said Marie, amazed. Gratitude. Sometimes, said Traoré, looking at the horizon of Ouagadougou through the window, the most powerful revolutions are born from the smallest sparks. 3 months later, the audit of French companies in Burkina Faso was completed. The results were mixed. Some companies met the standards, while others were accused of poor working conditions, environmental violations, and financial irregularities. Traoré, addressing the nation, announced that he would make separate decisions for each company. The good ones could stay, the bad ones would have to go. However, he stated that all would have to comply with new, fairer agreements. The same day, Traoré organized a historic conference with his African colleagues. Leaders of 15 African countries signed the African Resource Rights Convention, an agreement establishing common standards for natural resource use, foreign investment, and trade. We are no longer fragmented, said Traoré in his opening speech. We will no longer allow them to play us against each other. African resources belong to African peoples, and anyone who wants to partner with us must accept this fundamental principle. In the European capitals and Washington, Political leaders and the business world were trying to assess Africa's new confidence. Some saw it as a threat, while more progressive ones viewed it as an opportunity. In Brussels, the European Commission launched an initiative called A New Beginning with Africa, a program designed in response to Traoré's call. The United States also announced its own Africa Partnership Initiative. China, already having a strong presence in Africa, announced new investment packages. Competition was increasing, but this time, Africa was setting the terms. A year later, Ibrahim Traoré made an official visit to France, his first European visit since taking office. The French Prime Minister received him at the Élysée Palace. When the two leaders shook hands, photographers immortalized the moment. "President Traoré," said the Prime Minister, "welcome to Paris. Let this be an opportunity for us to turn a new page." "A new page," said Traoré, "but not the old book. We are starting a new book." The visit resulted in new economic agreements, cultural exchange programs, and joint research projects. But even more importantly, the Prime Minister gave an official apology for the French colonial past and called for a true partnership between the two countries. On the return flight to Ouagadougou, Traoré was talking with his advisor Marie. "A year ago," said Marie, "you angrily walked out of a meeting. Now you are one of the most influential leaders on the continent." "Not me," said Traoré humbly. "The people of Burkina Faso, the peoples of Africa, they have changed. They now know their value." "So, what really happened that day in Brussels?" asked Marie curiously. "Why exactly did you leave?" Traoré thought for a moment, then smiled. "Because it was time to refuse to just listen anymore. It was time to speak." He paused. "And sometimes, the most powerful words are not spoken. They are acted upon." As the plane glided through African skies below, the continent was changing. French, American, Chinese, and other international companies were still there, but now, operating under different conditions. Local communities were benefiting more. Revenues were being shared more fairly. And it all started with the use of the word gratitude at a summit and a leader who said enough and left the hall. Sometimes the greatest revolutions are born from the smallest sparks. And the spark that Ibrahim Traoré lit that day in Brussels had now turned into a fire illuminating the entire continent.